Oh, we have a return from Italy. Excellent. Welcome everyone to the 5th and final virtual session of the Southwest Festival of Japan. Today we have Wabi Sabi and the Wonder of the Everyday with Will Ywoman. Now, it may look like I'm sitting in Japan, but I'm actually in Bunbury, Western Australia. And to that end, I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wadandi Noongar people, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. My name is Carol McDowell, and I'm the Senior Officer, International Engagement for the City of Bunbury. Now, just a few housekeeping things before we get started. If you just have a look at the bottom of your screen, you should have your chat function. And if you can just pop into the chat function there and just give us a hello and let us know where you're from. I know we've got people calling in from all over the world. I saw we had a girls' college, St. Mary's College in Pune, India. So welcome to you. And also you can use this chat function to ask questions. We'll be taking questions at the end, and I will moderate those. So without further ado, today it's my pleasure to introduce you to Will Ywoman from the West Australian travel team. Before joining the travel team, Will was literary editor and senior arts writer at the West Australian, sorry. He's a former director of Perth Writers Week and New North Year Writers Festival. As a travel writer and photographer, Will's focus is on Japan and Western Australia, though he enjoys searching out all that's good in arts and culture, no matter where in the world he finds himself. Will, over to you.
Thank you. I think I've just successfully unmuted myself. Okay, minasan, konnichiwa. Yoroshiku onegaishimasu. My name is Will, as you've just learnt. It's great to be here with you all today to explore Wabi Sabi and the wonder of the everyday. Now, I'm just going to share my screen to just let you know what we've got planned for you in this session. Here we go. So hopefully everyone can see that rather floral looking mind map. I'll just get rid of that thing. There we go. So what I thought we'd do today, we've actually got what looks like a lot to cover, and it really is just a tasting plate of some aspects of Japanese aesthetics and how those of us who are not Japanese or not part of the Japanese culture can really apply some of these aspects to our everyday life, particularly in the area or the creative areas of photography and writing, and more specifically, travel photography and travel writing, which I'm sure most of us, at least normally, indulge in. Of course, we can do that throughout our great state at the moment, and I will include some photographs taken right here in Perth and in Western Australia for that purpose. So we're going to start with a little bit about this wonderful new book that's just come out called The Monocle Book of Japan, and I'll hold that up again when you can see me. We'll then talk about some of the origins of Japanese aesthetics. So we're looking at Shinto and Buddhist religions and so forth, the essential qualities of Japanese aesthetics, and then I'm going to break that down into Wabi Sabi, Wabi and Sabi, and so forth, as you can see. So we're moving clockwise around the circle. In each case, I will give you some examples from my own work, which hopefully will exemplify the quality we're under discussion at the time, and perhaps inspire you or give you some ideas in your own work. I'm then going to go to the writing aspect of this. I'm going to read an excerpt from a wonderful essay, which some of you may know, called In Praise of Shadows. And I'm then again going to give you some very brief excerpts from my own travel writing as well. And again, having gone through all of these qualities already, you'll perhaps be able to see how a lot of those qualities permeate the writing as much as the photography. And I guess the best analogy for me could be in cooking, where you're making a dish and you're adding all these different flavors and ingredients, and they kind of merge into one sort of dominant flavor, I guess, or one eating experience. And I suppose that's the kind of frame that I'm working with. We're then going to finish with looking at some connections with European aesthetics and European art, because there are some. And then I'm going to briefly let you know about some of the references as well. Now, just to remind you that this session is being recorded, which means you can certainly go back at any time to revisit and to revise any of the concepts under discussion. Okay, so I'll just stop this share for a moment. Where am I? I'm here. Okay, what's going on here? Why is that happening? Okay. Sorry about that, guys. Carol, you might be able to help me out here. I'm trying to get back onto the screen. If I stop sharing, there's me. So should I just double click on that?
We did see your screen.
There we go. How's that?
No,
Okay.
not yet. We can't see your screen yet.
No, but can you see me?
Oh, yes, I see you.
Sorry, that's what I'm after. Just so I can show people this wonderful book before I get back to that crazy mind map. Right, so this is the Monocle Book of Japan. It's around $90, so it's not super cheap, but it is one of those luxurious, as they call it, coffee table books. Now, the reason I'm starting with this book is not only because I spoke to the editor, Fiona Wilson, who's actually based in Tokyo. We spoke via Zoom, of course. It's also because it really does exemplify that connection with the everyday of aesthetics, of art, of creativity in Japan, right through to, as some of you will know, the packaging of everyday items. There's such meticulous care and creativity that goes into these everyday actions, even in contemporary society. And this book really explores that, and it draws on about 10 years of Monocle magazines covering Japan. And you go through things like, you know, business, retail, hospitality. You look at all these different vehicles. You look at those zany, crazy mascots that a lot of these companies have in Japan, as well as the more traditional arts and crafts like ikebana, the flower arrangements, the pottery, the tea ceremony, of course, such an integral part of Japanese culture, and we'll get back to that later on. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to play you a very short excerpt from my interview with Fiona Wilson, which will really, really nails it when it comes to exemplifying exactly what this book is about, and kind of leads in to what we're talking about today in our own discussion. So we'll get back to this crazy mind map here. And if I click on there, we'll get back to some of these photographs in a moment. I just want to play Fiona's. Okay, that's not a good look.
It was actually meant to coincide with the Olympics, the publication of this.
Hopefully you can hear all that.
Or just to preempt the Olympics. So it's quite interesting.
We can hear it, but we can't see her.
I think people have been talking a lot about Japan.
You can't see that.
Quite a few years.
Can't see her speaking.
But you can hear it.
Kind of
Yep.
Labour of love. It really represents, a decade of going up and down the country, visiting every corner, all kinds of stories that we've done. So for me personally, looking at the book, it's an amazing record of everything that's happened for Monocle here over a decade, more than a decade actually. And we've tried to show the different aspects of Japan. It's not like many other books in a way. It's very much our own perspective. It's the things that I particularly love about Japan. So it's a bit of the old and new, it's traditional, it's modern, it's the whole thing. And also I think something I really love about Japan, which is just the everyday, it's the ordinary that is often really, for me as an outsider, it's often the ordinary things that are really wonderful in Japan. So things that people take for granted, but I love, whether it's kids going to school, the experience of a convenience store, all those things, we hoped to record, as well as some of obviously the amazing architecture and the craft and the other aspects I think people do know quite a lot about.
Okay, so the everyday is what's so wonderful. I think that really hits the nail on the head for me, and that's what we're going to try to get across in today's conversation. So let's go back to the map here and have a look at some of the photography in this book up close. So some of you might have seen in the promo material this wonderful photograph of the Buddhist priest Torio Ito from Yosoku Inn, which is a sub-temple of Kennenji, Kyoto's oldest Zen temple. Now, you'd be happy to know I'm not going to test your eyesight here. You can look at these in full glorious colour there. I just admire the stillness and the serenity of this photograph, and also the framing. If you look further back in the distance, the shoji screens, you know, the doors, the tatami matting there. There are all these beautiful layers. And again, this will come back to haunt you later on when we talk about some of the concepts I'm going to introduce. Okay, so I love this one here too. This is picking gyokura, which is a kind of green tea leaf in the hilly town of Wadzuka. So let's have a look at that one. It's just not expanding. So I've just been told that it's not expanding for you.
Yeah, they're not expanding.
Okay, that's interesting.
It worked on our test.
No, it's all right. We're okay. We're okay. I've got my, let's try this. How's that? Is that working?
I haven't shared your screen. Your screen's not sharing.
That's all right. Sorry about this, guys. Just stay with us. Maybe I have to try a new share. Let's try this.
Yes, excellent.
Okay, that's the way we're going to have to do it. Sorry about that, guys. Anyway, this beautiful photograph of picking green tea. Look at the undulating patterns here, and the solitary figure, the tea picker walking through, cutting a diagonal across the right-hand side, or my right-hand side, of the picture. It exemplifies things like asymmetry, pattern, nature. It's all here in this picture. So again, that's something I really love about the book, and that's something that is, again, exemplified throughout the book, no matter what aspect of the culture they're actually talking about. I might just pick one more because it's proving to be a little bit laborious with the whole screen share thing. Let's try this guy. This baseball guy is amazing. We'll try him. Okay, can we see this guy? So yes. This is a fan of one of the local baseball teams. As some of you will know, Japanese are into baseball in a really big way. And what I love about this is, yes, it exemplifies the everyday, but the way that your ordinary person can celebrate what they love about their sport, much in the same way that West Australians might do with footy, for example, or cricket, but probably not to this outlandish extent. I just think this is such a wonderful photograph. So I think that's quite a lovely introduction to some of the concepts I'm talking about. So let me go back to the mind map and we'll briefly race through some of the concepts I have been discussing. Now you can all see this mind map okay, can't you?
Yes, that's great.
Great. Okay, so origin. So again, I'm not a Japanese historian. I'm not an expert in Japanese aesthetics at all. I just can see so many parallels with what some of us who work as photographers or writers or are creative, I can see so many parallels between what we're already doing and what went on and still goes on throughout Japanese creative history, that it's quite a lovely idea to see some of those mirrored in our own practices and perhaps gain some insight into an appreciation of what a different culture does in grappling with some of exactly the same things. So very quickly, if we look back in Japanese history at the Heian period, for example, 794 to 1185, we see some of the beginnings of a really sophisticated aesthetic culture, bearing in mind the Japanese had no word for aesthetics until the 19th century, but there was such a wealthy landed leisure class. And of course, when you have unlimited wealth and unlimited leisure, you have the time to devote to the arts and so forth Well, you do in civilized societies anyway. And we see in the Heian period this sort of, blossoming of this approach to life. But we also see that continuing after a few hundred years in the Edo period, the Tokugawa shogunate, when the shoguns were in charge. They took on this because it was considered a part of a warrior's culture to be cultivated. So things like the tea ceremony, ikebana, calligraphy, haiku, all these guys were soldiers, warriors, yes, but they were also poets and copious tea drinkers, of course, and fine calligraphers and wonderful artists as well. Then with the Meiji Restoration, with the restoration of royalty, so the Emperor Meiji in 1868 to 1912 is the beginnings of the modern period. And still we see through arts like the woodcut, for example, which really, the ukiyo-e woodcut craze that started in the Edo period, continuing here. And this kind of clash of cultures with the West, and still these aesthetic ideals survive. Now again, where did they spring from? The native Shinto religion, with the idea of the kami, or the ingrowing spirit. Everything was inhabited by a spirit. Everything was, the spirit was embodied in everything. Nature is almost another word for this, okay? Therefore, everything is to be respected. Everything is sacred. Taoist, Chinese Taoist philosophy also had an impact. It's essentially the native Chinese religion, if you like. Harmony, nature, and the Tao, or the way. And we see the word, the Tao or Do word, replicated in many Japanese words, like for the tea ceremony or for roads, for example. If I think about Sanjo Dori in Kyoto, that's Dori for road or way. So there are those remnants still there in today's society. Really big one was Zen Buddhism, of course, and a lot of these aesthetic ideas directly spring from Zen Buddhism. We think about Buddha nature, which is directly related in many ways to the kami and to nature. Everything is inhabited by Buddha nature. Everything is equal. Everything has equal value. This is very important because this looks forward to the egalitarian concepts of art being for everybody, of culture being for everybody. It's not exclusive, it's not elitist. And there's a little bit of the whole Confucian thing happening too, imported again from China, in the concept of self-improvement, a very important part of Confucian philosophy, where one has a responsibility to cultivate the arts as well as the physical arts, as well as sciences and so forth. Now, some of these aesthetic ideas sprang really from the practice, particularly of haiku, and some of you may have had the wonderful session yesterday, which I was a part of as well, where we had a haiku workshop, and you might recognize some of these concepts later on that we discussed there with Vari as well. Also the tea ceremony and no theatre. Okay, so they're three of the really sort of almost a tripod or pillars for some of the concepts that we're talking about today. So qualities, what are we thinking about overall qualities? We can have a look at a few little things here. I'll read them out because they're so small. Yiriku Saito, writing for the Oxford Dictionary of Aesthetics, identifies that aesthetic egalitarianism that I mentioned before. He also mentions implication, like implying something, suggestion, suggesting something, so it's all indirect. And those of us who have been to Japan or had something to do with Japanese culture will know that Japanese people are often indirect in the way they communicate. You know, they don't directly just say yes or no most of the time. They have very different ways of communicating. So this survives even in everyday exchanges. Imperfection, very important with Wabi Sabi. And respect for the essential character of the object, and that which directly goes back to the indwelling kami or the Buddha nature. So the respect for wood. Wood is often left undressed. They love the grain, the natural grain of the wood. It's best not to paint it. It's best not to do too much to it. You even see that in undressed concrete, for example, when the brutalist architecture was adopted in Japan. They love the texture and the color of plain concrete. Next, from Donald Keene, he was a fantastic Japanese translator and scholar who only died last year, I believe. I think he was in his 90s. He again says suggestion, irregularity, simplicity, and impermanence. And good old Wikipedia, which, you know, is actually pretty good sometimes. And on this, it's very good. So characteristics of the Wabi Sabi, according to Wikipedia. And we're all talking about equality here. So there you go. Aesthetic. So the Wabi Sabi aesthetic can include asymmetry, roughness, simplicity, economy, austerity, modesty, intimacy, and appreciation of the ingenious integrity of natural objects and processes. Okay, so they really together encompass the essential qualities that we're looking at today. Now, although it looks like there's a lot of things listed here, this really is, again, for those of you who are familiar with Japanese culture, I'm really only scratching the surface here. This is what I thought would be useful for us today to cover. So let's go forth. Starting with Wabi, I'm going to split up Wabi and Sabi because we've just had a look at what Wabi Sabi is together, and really it encompasses everything. If we take Wabi, for example, we look at meaning simple, austere beauty, the beauty of poverty. Okay? This is interesting because it immediately, this kind of aesthetic was accessible to anyone regardless of their wealth. And there are some commentators who talk about the poor or the less advantaged people being able to practice an authentic Wabi because frankly, that's their life, okay? Many of us have, I guess, a little more comfort and luxury. We're able to practice that in different ways. So I've got two photographs here which I've taken, one taken in Perth and one taken in Tottori, which is, some of you may know, the sand dunes in Japan. It's an incredible, incredible area. I am going to try to share this. Let's try that again. Can we see that?
Yes, that looks good.
Fantastic. Now, can I move this bar? Yes, I can. That's good too. Okay, this was just taken somewhere in Perth. Now, the thing about this photograph is its bleakness, its simplicity, its texture, its shadow. What drew me to this was the shadow, particularly of this dead plant in the top area there, casting its shadow, and that's counterbalanced by a much more diffuse shadow on the other side. And again, we have irregularity, we have poverty, we have impermanence, we have so many of these qualities going on at once. And that's a good point to make. I'm not trying to box in any of these images into exemplifying one particular aspect of Japanese aesthetics. There's actually a lot going on in each photograph. And the other important thing to mention is that, and this is something I wanted to try to get across today, it's not something you can consciously do. Those of you who meditate, for example, you don't try to meditate. What you do is try to create the conditions conducive to meditation. And this is exactly what you do when you take these kinds of photographs, I suppose. You might practice things, even if it's just looking at other people's photographs, absorbing yourself in haiku, enjoying walking through a park or along a beach, and having that mindfulness, that awareness, so that when you do come to have your camera in hand and you're walking along the street or something, you will be receptive to these kinds of qualities and you'll take the shot, as we like to say. So it's not like I can say to you, okay, go out and apply, Wabi and Sabi in your everyday sort of life or something. I don't know if it really works that way, and I'm sorry to disappoint you, but it's essential that the groundwork needs to be laid so that you open up a space for these things to just happen. And spontaneity is indeed another huge part of many aspects of Japanese aesthetics. So if we just go back to the other picture I wanted to talk about briefly, this has a human being in it, so that's great. but it's really talking about the same thing. So if I just share that with you, I'm going to get faster at this. Can you all see that?
Yep, we can see that.
Okay, so what I love, okay, I won't ask you again, I'll assume you can all see it. So this is really interesting because this is just me wandering the dunes, and I just saw this small child by himself, just amusing himself in this vast expanse of emptiness. And I thought, wow, this is pretty amazing. Didn't have my camera on me, I just had my mobile phone, as many of us do. And I should also point out that most of these photographs were taken with my mobile phone camera. You do not need fancy gear. You do not need to know a lot about photography. You just have to have the right mindset. So again, thinking about Wabi, this for me nicely encapsulates that, those concepts, but in a more human and perhaps a warmer sort of sense, if you like. Okay, so Sabi. If we think about Sabi, we think about what commentators call a rustic patina, lonely beauty, a slightly bleak quality suggesting age, deterioration, and the passage of time. Now, some of you may know that the word for Sabi is also derived from the word for rust. So you can kind of see the connections there. Now, for me, the best sort of process, if you like, that exemplifies Sabi is the sort of deterioration we get in damp areas, for example, where things are subject to the elements. And there's mold or mildew, or there's just deterioration in terms of disintegration and so forth, whether it's terracotta. Terracotta is particularly susceptible to a lot of this. And there are just plain walls. Now, I'll just show one here, actually, because I think we'll move on a bit. I quite like this one I took in Fremantle a few years ago because it also has a plant in it. Okay, there we go. So for me, this really is Sabi. This is the passage of time, the deterioration, the impermanence of nature, aging, being subject to the depredations of time and the elements. And I think it's so easy for you to just walk around, even your own house maybe. I hope it's not as bad as this, of course, and think, wow, that's actually pretty special. That's a work of art right there in itself. All I need to do is point my camera at it and bang, you've got it. And that's another thing I'm saying. None of these pictures I think are particularly special. What's special is that I was able to be there at that time and have the awareness to capture that moment. So there's a very big distinction for me. It's nothing sort of conscious here, or it's not like I'm trying to create anything at all. It's just allowing yourself to be open to nature and to the universe. Sorry if that sounds a little bit new agey, but you know where I'm coming from. So that for me is Sabi. Okay, let's go to the next concept I want to look at here. Mono no aware is a fantastic all-purpose concept. It literally means the pathos of things, okay? It's a lot to do with the sadness one feels at the passage of time, whether it's your own mortality or the mortality of others, whether they be people or animals or things. And we can see this in European art, for example, when you think about the vanitas symbol of flowers, because flowers do not last. And this is why cherry blossoms are so prized in Japan, because they, probably of all the blossoming plants, last the least amount of time. There's maybe only a week or so before they die. And this is exactly why they are prized so much, because they exemplify mono no aware. So I'll just pick one picture from here for that. And this is something I snapped in Melbourne while I was there on assignment a few years ago. Okay, there we go. So again, I was just walking down a dark alley in the middle of the night, as you do when you're in Melbourne, of course, and spotted this rather bleak scene. But I mean, I felt some kind of empathy. It made me feel a great deal of sadness, a great deal of, I don't know, melancholy, I guess is the right word. And the contrast between this person sitting there smoking a cigarette, could have been homeless, maybe, maybe not. There's a little a little poster, which is probably difficult to see there. Bring refugees here. You've got the graffiti, you've got the old sort of dilapidated part of the alleyway here. You've got the rubbish on the alleyway, and you've got this woman presumably going home from work after a long day in the office or wherever she works on a mobile phone. So again, it's probably not obvious that this is mono no aware, but I think for us as Westerners, this kind of experience and this kind of image, which is the residual experience, speaks of that quality. So again, for me, it's not about appropriating aspects of culture, it's about seeing connection, which I guess is what this wonderful festival has been all about the whole time. Okay, so mono no aware. So we'll go back to that crazy mind map again. I'm going to check the time here. I have a feeling I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to very quickly go through some of these, but not necessarily showing all the photographs, because I really do want to talk a little bit about the writing as well. Yugen is another great concept. Rich and mysterious beauty, often associated with no drama. Another meaning is grace, depth, and beauty. And I will show just one photograph here, because I think it's very special, because I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. This was an exhibition of the wonderful Japanese artist Shiota Chiharu at the Mori Art Museum in Tokyo. So I'll just bring this up and share it with you. Okay. You know, I think that's a pretty incredible image by anyone's standards. Again, nothing to do with me, just happened to be in the right place at the right time. The artwork, which again speaks to deterioration, but also mystery and depth, and that kind of beauty as well. And then you had this small child just standing there by herself, and I know watching her at the time, she rushed up to the piano, expecting somehow to play it. And then she's just swiveled around, and you can almost sense the dismay and the way she's sort of sucking her little hands there. And we're aware that this child is going to grow up to be a woman, okay? So again, there's a lot going on here, and I guess this complex web of black wool also speaks to that complexity, as well as the simplicity of design. So we'll leave that for now. Okay. So that's Yugen. That is rich, mysterious beauty. Another wonderful part of Japanese aesthetics is a quality called iki, I-K-I, iki in our translation. It is an urbane, chic, bourgeois type of beauty with undertones of sensuality. It's also refined style. It's often incorrect to associate this with eroticism, but I think the underlying or the undertones of sensuality is the right approach. And you'll often see this in ukiyo-e woodcuts, for example, particularly of women, particularly perhaps exposing the nape of the neck and so forth. So this concept of simplicity and elegance combined, it's actually a very difficult concept to translate and even more difficult to understand. But I actually really love it without fully understanding it, as is probably the case with all of this. I'm not sure you have to understand everything in order to appreciate it, as you do with art, for example. The next concept is mujo, which is directly related to impermanence, okay? We're born, we're going to die. Plants live and die. Everything lives and dies. Everything is impermanent. Only Buddha nature persists through eternity. And I had this little tiny picture of a snail crawling across a mat there. I won't open it because we're running out of time. And there's a lovely haiku, which some of you may know. I think it's Basho or Issa. "Oh snail, climb Mount Fuji, but slowly, slowly." So I really quite love that concept of mujo. Yojo is another great concept. It means an emotional aftertaste. Now this is all about implication. This is what I was talking about before. We go back to that idea of never saying anything directly. Why? Because if you do that, the imagination loses the opportunity to engage. Whereas if you just suggest something, and we're all aware of this, not just in everyday life, but in films, TV, arts, music, that merely suggests something and leaves it to your imagination to work out the rest. This was highly prized and still is in Japanese aesthetics. Shibui, I really love. It means an astringent, dry, subdued quality. Now, for me, that is all about minimalism, okay? It's about less is more. And that's a sort of classic quality of Japanese design, for example, but also Scandinavian design, as I'm sure many of you will appreciate. Mumon is an interesting one. That's something that's accomplished in a straightforward and unhesitant manner, okay, or without pattern or design. And in a way, this is what I've been talking about all along, this idea of just going out there and taking the shot. And there's no real intent there, okay? The intentional fallacy is just that. It's a fallacy in the artist. I will show you just one shot here to demonstrate that, because it's not what we would call a very picturesque subject. But I really loved, now why is that not going to show me that? Let's just have a look. Okay, got the screen there. If it doesn't come up, I'm going to have to leave it. Okay, we won't waste any time with that. Anyway, basically what it was a picture of some rubbish. If any of you can even make that out. But I expand it a bit, okay? Just a whole pile of rubbish. But for some reason, there was a quality about it that just spoke to me. And it's interesting, isn't it, that they talk about here things being straightforward, where before we were just talking about things not being straightforward and being indirect. So that's quite a lovely tension there between the two qualities. Okay, so if I just quickly summarize what I've been talking about with photography and thinking about your own photography, these are some of the qualities to think about. We've got, going clockwise again from the top, we've got color, minimalism, asymmetry, capturing the essence of something quickly, and photographs really do say more than 1,000 words, or speak 1,000 words. Novelty, looking for something that's different or interesting, not photographing the same thing that everyone else has photographed just because it's famous. Indirectness, suggestion, texture, always be on the lookout for interesting textures. This is why I just love photographing walls, for example. There's just so much going on. Thinking about composition, and again, that relates back to irregularity or asymmetry. Okay, don't just use the rule of thirds all the time. Don't just look for verticals and horizontals. Look for diagonals, look for things that are out of kilter, but do it mindfully. It's not something, otherwise it just looks like a bad photograph, okay? Kirei is another very good quality. It means cutting, and people who talk about haiku talk about that a lot, this sort of cut or turn from one concept to the next. So it's very important in photography in terms of cutting an image off at a very odd or very tension-filled place, which I'm sure a lot of you are aware of, which is something that photography, when it was first invented, brought to painting, and all the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists started doing it. They started cutting their paintings in really interesting ways, and that was due to the advent of photography. Okay, let's look at some writing. Now, again, a lot of those connections are the same, but I want to introduce some other concepts here before I read a little bit. Think about breaking up your rhythm. There's nothing worse than using all short sentences or all long sentences. You know, we love variety and we actually do love asymmetry. So one of my favorite things is to use maybe a succession of short sentences and then one long sentence, for example, which is a kind of a release or a closing cadence, if you like. I love brainstorming. If I've traveled all day and then I sit down and I think, oh my God, what am I going to write about? You know, draw a mind map or just whatever your best sort of, your favorite form of brainstorming is, and just let out anything and try to recall the day's experiences, the day's events. Just get it all out there. Alongside that, exploit your ignorance. I often love going to a new country or a new city without knowing a single thing about it. So doing absolutely no research. I'm not saying I do this all the time, and you certainly wouldn't want to do it if you've organised your own trip. But even if you just go out on a day trip, for example, or just walk the streets of an unfamiliar city, embrace your ignorance, because you'll learn to see as a child, and you really will. And it's just incredible what you remember, what stays with you from that, far more than it would if you were trying to interpret everything. Again, show, don't tell is a very common technique in writing. Use images rather than explanation. Focus in on small details. Remember mindfulness, recollection we've covered, sensitivity to nature we've covered, reflection we've covered. Fragments, don't be afraid of using fragments and building up fragments. This is a common technique in haiku and it works wonderfully in prose as well. The last one I want to touch on here is another aesthetic concept called zuihitsu. Hitsu, very hard to say. Zuihitsu. It means literally following the brush. It's kind of like stream of consciousness writing, but it really means just being attuned to where the pen or your fingers on the keyboard want to go and following that. So it's ideally suited to the travel essay, okay? So I'm just going to give you a few quick examples of what I've been talking about in the writing area. I'll just bring myself back up here. Okay, here we go. Hello everybody, I'm back. I briefly mentioned before that wonderful essay by Junichiro Tanizaki. It's called In Praise of Shadows. And there's a very famous passage where he writes about toilets. And this goes to the heart of the matter, where everything, no matter how, well, we consider maybe dirty or commonplace, everything is of aesthetic and artistic value. I love this. Every time I'm shown to an old, dimly lit, and I would add impeccably clean toilet in a Nara or Kyoto temple, I am impressed with the singular virtues of Japanese architecture. The parlor may have its charms, but the Japanese toilet is truly a place of spiritual repose. I love that. It always stands apart from the main building at the end of a corridor in a grove fragrant with leaves and moss. No words can describe that sensation as one sits in the dim light, basking in the faint glow reflected from the shoji, lost in meditation or gazing out at the garden. The novelist Natsume Soseki counted his morning trips to the toilet a great pleasure, a psychological delight, he called it. And surely there could be no better place to savour this pleasure than a Japanese toilet, where, surrounded by tranquil walls and finely grained wood, one looks out upon blue skies and green leaves. So, I mean, he goes on in this vein. And if any of you haven't read this wonderful essay, it's available for free download on the internet. Just search with Google and you should be able to get a PDF or a Word document copy. Well worth reading. So I wanted to briefly touch on some examples from my own travel writing. And hopefully you'll be able to recall some of the qualities we've been discussing and see how they're operating in the writing. Now this one is describing parts of the Wells Cathedral. That's not Wales, that's Wells, W-E-L-L-S. It's the UK's smallest city, for those of you who don't know. And I was quite taken with the more dilapidated, ruined sort of aspects of the the outer part of the cathedral's walls and indeed within the walls. So further beyond the cathedral is the Bishop's Palace and Gardens, a decaying moated residence of the Bishops of Bath and Wells. The wells, literally springs, which give the city its name, can still be seen in the gardens. I love the tranquility of the palace's moat, on which float geese, ducks and white swans, and the gardens and streams with their golden weeping willows. I walk around to the far side of the cathedral's cloisters, reading the inscriptions on memorial plaques adorning the walls. Finding an ancient wooden door, I open it and step through. I am in a secluded graveyard, just outside the massive south transept of the cathedral. Here are the exposed foundations of the late medieval Lady Chapel, as well as those remnants of Roman, Saxon and early medieval chapels and cemeteries, all excavated as late as the 1970s. The surfaces of most of the tombstones and gravestones are pockmarked by the elements, covered in moss. The sky is overcast, but occasionally the sun breaks through, causing the shadows of crosses and trees to overlap the ancient foundations. And everywhere, evidence of the destruction wrought by the English Reformation, the Civil War, and other calamities. Okay, so I hope you could sense some of the qualities we were discussing in that writing there. Again, it's just me, I guess, in a sense, being receptive to these qualities and not necessarily being conscious of them per se. And I really urge you to try to cultivate that sensibility, because it really opens you, yes, to the sadness of these objects, but also to the beauties of what perhaps a lot of people would normally just walk past. Now, just another brief example, and this is like a companion piece, if you like. This is from Churches of Somerset. So Wells is in Somerset, for those of you who might know that area of England. And there's some beautiful old village churches which I love to explore. I love the loneliness of them, the antiquity of them. They're really quite gorgeous. One in particular is Croscombe. Croscombe's 15th century parish church of St. Mary the Virgin is every bit the hidden gem it has been described as. But it's chiefly remarkable for its Jacobean woodwork, purported to be some of the best in the UK. The ornate screen and pulpit are superb, but the Jacobean box pews are really impressive. I sit in one, trying to imagine the preacher's voice and the sounds of a small choir and organ, and perhaps even a viol consort. The vapour from my mouth melts into the icy gloom. I love, too, closing my eyes and running my fingers over the poppy head finials of the bench ends and other carvings, so I can at least feel, in a real rather than imagined sense, what long dead worshippers might have felt. On the way out, I run into a lady vicar who's all smiles. Shepton Mallet's parish church of St. Peter and Paul is much grander and of greater antiquity. To get there, I walk through the paved high street and past the old market cross of the town square. It's clear that life here continues as it has done for centuries. Elderly couples hobble down paths with their walking sticks and small dogs. Some enter butchers or bakers or cafes. Tradies laugh and curse as they go about their business. Lovers stroll arm in arm, their only destination, each other. So that's Somerset. So again, there's a sort of, I don't know, kind of tuning in, not just to the grand nature of the churches, but also to their lonely state and also to the ordinary people going about their ordinary business as they have done for centuries. There's a lovely sense of continuity there, and also a sense that these people are just as important as any famous, church or cathedral. And indeed, they're a part of that because they're part of the congregation, presumably. So I'm going to leave the writing with just one more very tiny section, and this goes to Vietnam. Just 2 paragraphs here. In Keats' poem To Autumn, the poet sings, "Where are the songs of spring? Aye, where are they? Think not of them. Thou has thy music too." A Vietnamese winter has its music too. Melancholy ruins rising up from the sodden earth as fowl and buffalo take possession of flooded rice paddies. Distant views of verdant mountainous terrain obscured by black pregnant clouds. Hundreds of bicyclists and motorcyclists clad in brightly coloured plastic ponchos, sweeping through rain-slicked streets in a complicated dance like petals borne aloft by a moist wind. So perhaps I'm going a little bit overboard with the purple prose there, but this was one of my earliest travel pieces, probably written more than 10 years ago when I first joined the West. So I'm not going to be too hard on myself. Anyway, hopefully you get the sense of what's going on there. So let's just finish before we go to questions with some connections with European art and aesthetics. The sublime, we're thinking about, the grandeur of nature. So this is a very romantic notion, perhaps a little bit old fashioned now. We're thinking about the picturesque, those lovely English gardens in the 18th and 19th centuries, which took as their models the paintings, the landscape paintings of Claude, for example, and built their gardens around it. So they're not talking about the formal parterres of France. They're looking at nature, maybe slightly encouraged in the way that one might do in Ikebana. But it's wild. Nature is allowed to run rampant in certain places, okay? So very important. The cult of ruins, which grew up centuries ago, this love of ruined temples, cathedrals, buildings, and you see it in art from, about, 16th century, maybe from the Renaissance anyway, right up until the late 19th century. And I'm thinking about maybe artists that use the ruins as follies, if you like, in a landscape, or just to exemplify what we've been talking about before, the idea of decay, impermanence, and of the folly of mankind, or humankind, I should say, building to the greater glory or aggrandizement of themselves. We've talked briefly about Scandinavian design, obvious connections there. The cult of melancholy, which grew up in the Elizabethan period. Fantastic, okay? Memento Mori and Vanitas, those classic symbols that we see in Western art all the time. Memento Mori especially, you might see a skull, or you might see a beautiful young woman gazing into a mirror. So for me, all of these have connections with Japanese aesthetics. Now, finally, if I let you know some of the references, and again, this is recorded so you can go back to this. I've drawn for some of my research on the wonderful entry on Japanese aesthetics in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy that is available for free online. It's such a great resource, and I strongly urge you all to go and make use of it. There's also Japanese Aesthetics, an historical overview in the Encyclopedia of Aesthetics, Oxford University Press. Not free, but it's certainly worth following up. The wonderful writer on Japan, the American writer Donald Ritchie, he wrote a slender volume called A Tractate on Japanese Aesthetics. Beautifully written, covers so much more than what we've covered today. Junichiro Tanitsuki's In Praise of Shadows, I've mentioned. And of course, the wonderful Penguin Book of Haiku, which is a fantastic compendium, not just of haiku from across many centuries, but also a lot of the concepts in the opening essays and introductions, a lot of the concepts we're discussing today, and very good at placing them in their correct historical context. So, Carol, I'm going to hand over to you to moderate questions now. I think we've got enough time for a few questions.
Yeah, well, I've got time, so love to take some questions from everyone. If anyone has any questions for Will on writing or photography.
Just not Japanese aesthetics. I'm not an expert. Please don't be hard on me.
We did have a comment about your first piece that you read, that it wonderfully combines so many of the elements that you spoke about.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you so much. It's very kind. I'm glad that got through.
Yeah, and the second one you read, I thought, just looking back at my notes, that it incorporated Yugen, the rich and mysterious beauty of walking through that cathedral, and Mono no Aware, just with the couple walking outside, just the passing of time.
No, thank you. No, I really do hope that people go back to whatever they do and really try and think about these qualities. And if they are writers or they are photographers, I'd really love to see them, utilizing these resources in their own work.
If I can pick on somebody. The last slide that you had there with the European elements, one of the last ones you had there, it sounded Italian. Was that a, if you go back to that slide?
Sure. Oh, okay. No, I think I can remember them. So they were both Latin.
Latin.
So
Oh, okay.
you think about Memento Mori and
Yep.
Vanitas.
Yep.
Yeah. So both Latin. Google them. You'll get heaps. Yeah.
All right. So this is from, excuse my pronunciation, Shreya. Hello. It was a wonderful session. Not exactly a question, but how would you say certain filters may be used to exercise Wabi Sabi in photography? Great question.
That is a really, really good question. I mean, I tend to avoid filters, to be honest. If I'm posting on Insta, for example, I do spend a lot of time, however, using Photoshop. It's just such a great resource. I'm not one of these people, I'm not one of these purists that will take a photograph and then think, well, that's it, you can't touch it. I treat it more as a painter does. So I go back with Photoshop or a similar program, or even some of the apps you've got on your phone, that the native photo apps do have great resources for altering the appearance of your photograph. So rather than using filters, I enjoy playing with a lot of the settings, like, you know, pulling out the shadows a bit, for example, playing with the contrast, the saturation. I actually really love going towards desaturation rather than the other way, because that gives a lovely sort of bleak quality to the picture, which for me sometimes is actually very Japanese. It goes back to the old Fujifilm look. And you kind of get the same effect you would get with using a filter, but you've got more control. It's more hands-on. And that really speaks to what we're talking about today, rather than simply applying a filter. I mean, I'm not saying you shouldn't, but personally, I'm not really into filters.
Excellent, great. Oh, this question is, where can we find the recordings, and how do we stay in contact? Because that would be really great. Well, so this is recorded, and next week I will send you out a link to this video, which will be on YouTube. I should mention at this time that the Southwest Festival of Japan has a YouTube channel, and if you subscribe to that channel, you'll get to see all of the virtual workshops we've had this week. So we've had one last night on haiku, we've had one on Japanese teas, one on doing business with Japan, and one on Japanese cooking. So if any of that interests you, I do encourage you to have a look at our YouTube page, and I'll send that out in the email. And Will works for the West Australian, so I'm sure you can always find him there.
Yep, our details are on their website, so no secret.
You can't hide.
I can't hide, afraid not.
And Giffen Jolly says, I'll definitely incorporate these in my writings. Excellent.
Great to hear.
All right, just giving people some time if they're typing away their questions, but I might just start to wrap things up here first by saying thank you, Will, for coming on board with this this webinar. You were the first person that I asked to do the webinar, and then you're the last one to present. So thank you for coming on board, because I thought, well, if Will Ywoman said yes, I'm going to ask some other people to do it as well. So thank you very much for that.
It's an absolute really pleasure, Carol, and I feel honoured that you asked me in the first place. So
really great presentation, and I am going to watch it again, because some really interesting tidbits in there. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, really from around the world. We had people from Scotland, India, Italy again, Mornington Peninsula, Brisbane, of course from Bunbury, Margaret River, Swanbourne. And it's one of the things that I was saying to Will before that I love about this festival, is it brings all cultures together for us to celebrate together elements of Japanese culture that we love. So if you can come to our festival tomorrow in Bunbury, please do. It's from 10 to 2 at the Sterling Street Arts Center. We also have our stamp rally going on, where you can win all sorts of amazing prizes, including 3 boxes of chocolates donated by Nakamura Chocolates, who was one of our presenters earlier this week. And we have taiko on performing, we have martial arts, we have Japanese food and stall holders. And if you're in Bunbury, actually tonight, if you come down to the art gallery at 5:45, taiko on is doing a performance there. You can get a sneak preview. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to Will, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Sayonara.
Lovely.
Sayonara.
Thank you so much.